The first thing to wake the house was not the screaming. It was the smell. A predatory, invasive odor, thick with the scent of burning resin and old pine, creeping under doorways and through the floorboards. It was the smell of a structure being consumed from within. In the servants' quarters, a young housemaid named Clara coughed herself awake, her lungs filled with an acrid haze. The air was unnaturally warm, shimmering in the moonlight that filtered through her small window. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of sleep. She threw open her door to a scene from Dante's Inferno. The grand central hallway of the Monroe residence, normally a place of polished wood and silent opulence, was a churning corridor of orange and black. Flames licked up the walls, devouring the expensive flocked wallpaper and casting monstrous, dancing shadows. And then she heard it. High and thin, cutting through the roar and crackle of the fire, came the screams. They were coming from above. From the third floor, from the small, steep staircase that led to the attic. Clara's blood ran cold. She knew who was up there, 8-year-old Alina and 6-year-old Thomas. She also knew who had put them there, the governess, Miss Evelyn Reed. A punishment, she had called it, for some minor childhood transgression earlier that evening. Clara raced toward the main staircase, the heat blistering her face, but a wall of fire erupted before her, driving her back. There was no way up. The screams from the attic grew more desperate, more terrified, a sound of pure, abject horror that would be seared into the memory of anyone who heard it. They were trapped, not just by the fire but by something far more deliberate. The heavy oak door to the attic, she remembered with a sickening lurch, had been bolted from the outside. To understand the gravity of the horror unfolding within those burning walls, one must first understand the Monroe family and their place in the Savannah of 1873. This was the era of Reconstruction, a fragile, volatile time in the American South. Old money and new industry collided in a society desperately trying to redefine itself from the ashes of the Civil War. William and Genevieve Monroe were pillars of this new society. Their wealth, derived from shipping and cotton speculation, afforded them a life of curated perfection. Their 3-story Georgian mansion on the outskirts of the city was a testament to their status, a fortress of prosperity with manicured gardens, gas lighting, and a full staff of servants who moved through the halls like ghosts. The Monroes were not merely wealthy, they were influential, their names synonymous with respectability and Southern grace. They had 2 children, Alina and Thomas, who were by all accounts the radiant center of their world. Alina, with her mother's dark hair and a precocious intellect, and Thomas, a boisterous, bright-eyed boy who was the heir to the Monroe name. They were the living embodiment of the family's legacy, the promise of its continuation. But behind the facade of domestic bliss, a subtle darkness had begun to fester, an insidious presence that had arrived only 3 months prior. It came in the form of Miss Evelyn Reed, the new governess. She was hired to shape the minds of the Monroe children, to instill in them the discipline and etiquette required of their station. From the moment she arrived, however, the atmosphere in the grand house began to change, the air growing heavier, colder. The children's laughter, once a constant, joyful sound, became infrequent, replaced by a nervous, watchful silence. The staff whispered among themselves about the new governess, about her unnervingly pale eyes and the rigid, almost cruel discipline she exacted. But the Monroes, it seemed, saw only results. They saw obedience. They saw order. They were blind to the creeping dread that was slowly consuming their home, a dread that was about to find its horrifying climax in fire and smoke. Miss Evelyn Reed did not arrive in Savannah with a flourish of recommendations from esteemed families. Her origins were a matter of calculated ambiguity. She presented a single, notarized letter from a clergyman in Boston, a man who, if anyone had cared to investigate, had been dead for 5 years. The letter spoke of her piety, her stern dedication to moral instruction, and her unparalleled ability to tame even the most wayward of children. For Genevieve Monroe, who valued propriety and order above all else, this was more than enough. She was tired of the parade of kindly, ineffective local women who had failed to command her children's respect. Miss Reed was different. She was tall and unnervingly thin, dressed in severe, dark colors that seemed to absorb the light around her. Her hair was pulled back so tightly that it sharpened the angles of her face, giving her a perpetual look of disapproval. Her voice was low and melodic, yet it carried an unmistakable edge of authority that silenced her. In why room she entered, the children reacted to her with an immediate, instinctual fear. Thomas, who had once filled the house with the sound of imaginary battles, fell quiet in her presence. Eleanor, a curious and inquisitive girl, stopped asking questions. Miss Reed's methods were subtle at first. Privileges were revoked for the smallest of infractions. A misplaced toy would result in an evening without supper. A smudged line in a copybook would mean an hour of standing silent and motionless in a corner. These punishments were always delivered away from the prying eyes of the parents, often in the schoolroom on the second floor. The servants noticed the changes. They saw the children's withdrawn expressions, the faint, bluish bruises that sometimes appeared on their arms, explained away by the governess as the results of boisterous play. They heard the hushed, fearful whispers between the siblings when they thought no one was listening. But in the rigid social hierarchy of a household like the Monroes, the staff knew their place. To question the judgment of their employers, especially regarding the esteemed governess, was a forbidden act, a line they dared not cross. And so they watched, silent and helpless as a creeping, macabre chill settled over the home. The Monroe mansion itself seemed to conspire with the governess's oppressive reign. It was a house of secrets, built in the late 18th century, and like many old Southern homes, it was steeped in folklore and whispered histories. Local legend held that the land had once been the site of a makeshift hospital during a yellow fever epidemic, a place where the dead were buried in unmarked graves to prevent the spread of the disease. It was said that the ground itself was soured by grief and suffering. The house was filled with long, dark hallways, rooms that remained perpetually cold even in the suffocating Georgia heat, and staircases that creaked with no one on them. For Eleanor and Thomas, their home, once a playground of endless discovery, was transforming into a labyrinth of fear. Under Miss Reed's supervision, entire sections of the house became forbidden territories. The grand library, with its comfortable leather chairs, was now off-limits. The gardens, once a place for games of hide-and-seek, were only to be entered for structured, silent walks. Their world shrank until it consisted of only 3 rooms: their nursery, the schoolroom, and the dining room, where they ate their meals in tense silence under the watchful gaze of their governess. Miss Reed seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of their movements. If they whispered a secret in the nursery, she would appear at the door as if summoned, her pale eyes narrowed with suspicion. The children began to speak of a shadow woman, a figure they claimed to see lingering at the end of hallways or reflected in mirrors when Miss Reed was near. They told their mother that the governess smelled of damp earth and smoke, even on the sunniest of days. Genevieve Monroe dismissed these as childish fantasies, the products of an overactive imagination being brought to heel by much-needed discipline. She praised Miss Reed for curing her children of their flights of fancy. But the housemaid, Clara, knew better. She had seen the strange symbols Miss Reed sometimes traced in the dust on windowsills, and had once found a small, crudely made doll of twine and black cloth hidden beneath the governess's mattress. It was a disturbing, macabre object, and a cold dread told her it was not meant for child's play. The heart of Miss Reed's dominion was the attic. Before her arrival, it had been a place of forgotten treasures and rainy-day adventures for the Monroe children. It was a repository of family history, filled with steamer trunks, dusty furniture shrouded in white cloths, and boxes of old letters and photographs. Under the governess, its function became something far more sinister. The attic was transformed into a place of punishment. It was not a place for a mere timeout. It was a chamber of psychological torment. Its single, grimy window offered a sliver of a view of the sky, but mostly it was a space of deep shadows and unsettling silence. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and decay. For any infraction Miss Reed deemed significant, a defiant look, a tearful protest, a whispered complaint, the sentence was the same: to the attic with you. The journey up the narrow, steep staircase was an ascent into terror. The governess would lead the condemned child by the arm, her grip like iron, her face a mask of cold indifference. At the top stood the heavy oak door, fitted with an old, formidable iron bolt. The sound of that bolt sliding into place was the sound of utter abandonment. Sometimes the children were left there for an hour, other times for an entire afternoon. They would be left in the darkness with no candle, instructed to contemplate their failings. What happened in that attic in T. Ho's long, silent hours remains a chilling mystery. The children would emerge pale and trembling, their eyes wide with a fear they could not or would not articulate. When questioned by a worried Clara, Alina once whispered of scratches on the inside of the door and of a cold spot in the corner that breathes. Thomas refused to speak of it at all, developing a nervous tic and a paralyzing fear of the dark. The attic became a forbidden zone, a place of unspeakable dread that held a powerful, psychological grip over the entire household. It was the ultimate weapon in Miss Reed's arsenal of control, a macabre theater where she broke the spirits of the two small children entrusted to her care. No one could have known she was merely setting the stage for her final, horrifying act. As the summer of 1873 deepened, the oppressive atmosphere within the Monroe mansion began to take a visible toll on the children. Their physical and emotional states deteriorated at an alarming rate. Thomas, once a robust and energetic boy, grew thin and listless. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and he was plagued by relentless nightmares that left him screaming in his sleep. He lost interest in his toys and spent his days staring blankly out the nursery window. Alina, in turn, became preternaturally quiet and watchful, her movements furtive and anxious, like a cornered animal. She developed a persistent, dry cough and would often be found hiding in closets or under her bed, clutching a small wooden cross she had taken from her mother's jewelry box. The family physician, Dr. Alastair Finch, was summoned. He was a man of old-world sensibilities, quick to diagnose such ailments as nervous exhaustion or melancholia, common afflictions among the women and children of the upper class. He examined the children in the presence of Miss Reed, whose calm, articulate explanations seemed to satisfy his every inquiry. The boy's lack of appetite, a result of the summer heat; the girl's anxiety, a natural part of her delicate, feminine maturation. He prescribed tonics of iron and quinine and advised more rest and fresh air, recommendations that Miss Reed assured him would be followed to the letter. Of course, they were not. The governess used the doctor's diagnosis to further isolate the children. Citing their fragile conditions, she restricted their contact with the rest of the staff and forbade them from playing with the neighborhood children who sometimes visited. Their world, already small, was now shrinking to the point of suffocation. William and Genevieve Monroe, caught up in their own demanding social schedules, saw only what Miss Reed wanted them to see: a dedicated governess diligently nursing their sickly children. They were tragically, fatally, oblivious to the fact that the woman they had entrusted with their most precious treasures was not a healer, but the very source of the sickness that was consuming them. The disturbing reality was a cold case in the making, unfolding slowly and silently within the very heart of their home. The mystery of Miss Evelyn Reed's identity is a central, horrifying pillar of this story. In the aftermath of the tragedy, when investigators would desperately try to piece together her past, they would find themselves chasing a ghost. The name Evelyn Reed appeared to be a complete fabrication. There was no record of her birth, no family to speak of, no prior employment that could be verified. The letter from the deceased Boston clergyman was the only piece of documentation she possessed, a masterful piece of forgery that had passed the cursory inspection of a trusting and ultimately doomed family. She was, in essence, a phantom who had walked into the Monroes' lives from a void. This anonymity was her greatest weapon. It allowed her to operate without fear of consequence, to enact her macabre designs with chilling impunity. Where did she come from? The question has haunted local historians and crime enthusiasts for over a century. Some theories, leaning toward the macabre, suggest she was not a woman at all, but some malevolent entity drawn to the house by its own dark history, a manifestation of the land's cursed past. Others propose a more grounded, yet equally disturbing possibility, that she was a serial predator, a new and terrifying archetype of criminal that the 19th century was not yet equipped to understand. This theory posits that she moved from city to city, from family to family, using a different name each time, leaving a trail of quiet devastation in her wake. Perhaps there were other children in other grand houses who had suddenly fallen ill or other unexplained accidents that were never properly investigated. The thought is chilling. A woman with no past, no identity, and no soul, preying on the wealthy and complacent, using their own social conventions and blind trust against them. If you find yourself captivated by these dark, unsolved cases, consider subscribing to our channel. We delve into the forbidden archives of history to uncover stories that have been deliberately forgotten. And the case of Evelyn Reed is a prime example of a cold case that is as terrifying today as it was in 1873. The servants of the Monroe household existed in a state of perpetual, low-grade fear. They were the silent witnesses, the ones who saw the subtle cruelties and felt the oppressive shift in the home's atmosphere. Their fears, however, were unspoken, confined to hushed conversations in the kitchen and meaningful glances exchanged in the hallways. To voice their concerns would be to risk their livelihood, and in the uncertain economy of Reconstruction Georgia, a steady position in a wealthy household was not something to be trifled with. The cook, a stout, pragmatic woman named Martha, was the first to notice the issue with the food. Miss Reed insisted on preparing the children's plates herself, claiming they had delicate stomachs that required a special diet. Martha watched as the governess would sometimes add a fine white powder to their milk or porridge, explaining it away as a calming herbal supplement prescribed by the doctor. Yet Dr. Finch had prescribed no such thing. The children's lethargy and sickness seemed to worsen after these doctored meals. Then there was the groundskeeper, an old man named Samuel, who observed Miss Reed's strange nocturnal habits. He would see a single candle burning in the attic window late at night, long after the children had been brought down and the rest of the house was dark. He once saw her digging near the roots of an ancient, dying oak tree at the edge of the property, burying a small, dark bundle in the earth. When he went to investigate the next day, he found the ground had been disturbed, but was too unnerved to dig up whatever she had hidden there. The housemaid, Clara, was perhaps the most troubled. She was closest in age to the children and felt a protective affection for them. She saw firsthand the way they flinched when Miss Reed entered a room. She was the one who found Alina's favorite doll, its porcelain face smashed and its dress torn, hidden at the bottom of a laundry basket. Alina, when asked, would only whisper, "Miss Reed says dolls are vain and foolish things." Clara started to believe that the governess was not merely strict, but deeply, pathologically cruel. She harbored a growing, terrifying conviction that something truly awful was going to happen. She just never could have imagined the scale of it. Just weeks before the fire, an event occurred that should have been a screaming red flag to the Monroe parents, but was instead masterfully manipulated by the governess. It involved Thomas's 6th birthday. Genevieve had planned a small party, inviting the children of several prominent Savannah families. It was to be a rare moment of joy and levity in the increasingly somber household. Thomas, for the first time in months, seemed to show a spark of his old self, excited at the prospect of cake and games with his friends. The day of the party arrived, and with it, a strange tension. Miss Reed was a constant, hovering presence, her expression even more severe than usual. As the children played a game of tag in the garden, one of the visiting boys accidentally tripped and scuffed his knee. It was a minor incident, but Miss Reed treated it as a catastrophe. She declared the games too rowdy and unsafe, and ordered all the children inside for a period of quiet reflection. The party atmosphere immediately evaporated. Later, as the cake was being served, Thomas, in his excitement, reached for a slice before the guests had been served. Miss Reed's reaction was swift and shockingly disproportionate. She snatched the plate from his hand and publicly berated him for his selfish and gluttonous behavior. The boy, humiliated in front of his friends, burst into tears. The party ended shortly after, the guests leaving in a state of awkward discomfort. When Genevieve later questioned Miss Reed's harshness, the governess spun a masterful tale. She spoke of Thomas's increasingly defiant and unstable temperament, framing her actions as a necessary, albeit painful, disciplinary measure to prevent a full-blown tantrum. She even hinted that his emotional outbursts were a symptom of a deeper, perhaps hereditary mental fragility. She planted a seed of doubt and fear in Genevieve's mind, not only excusing her own cruelty, but also further isolating the children. From that day on, there were no more parties, no more visiting friends. The last bridge connecting Alina and Thomas to the outside world had been burned, long before the first flame ever touched their home. The escalating dread in the Monroe house began to manifest in physical, macabre ways. It was no longer just a feeling or a suspicion. It was a series of small, disturbing discoveries. Clara, while cleaning the schoolroom, found a dead sparrow lying on the windowsill. Its neck had been cleanly and deliberately broken. When she showed it to Miss Reed, the governess showed no surprise, simply stating that the bird must have flown into the glass. But the window was closed, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the small, lifeless creature was a message, a warning of some kind. A few days later, while changing the linens in the governess's room, she noticed a faint, dark stain on the floorboards beneath the rug. It was a deep, rusty brown, and when she touched it, she realized with a jolt of horror that it was dried blood. Whose blood it was, she couldn't dare to imagine. Perhaps the most horrifying discovery belonged to Alina. One evening, after being released from a punishment in the attic, she came down to the nursery shivering, despite the humid Georgia air. She was clutching a small, tarnished silver locket. It was not her mother's. She told Clara that she had found it tucked into a crack in the attic floorboards. When she opened it, there was no portrait inside. Instead, it contained a tightly folded piece of paper. On the paper was a list of names, 4 of them, written in a spidery, unfamiliar script. Beside each name was a date. The final name on the list was Alina, and beside it the date was circled in red ink, October 29, 1873, the night of the fire. At the time, neither of them understood the significance. It was just another creepy, inexplicable object from the forbidden attic. Alina was made to give the locket to Miss Reed, who confiscated it with a thin, unsettling smile, remarking that it was best not to meddle with things that don't concern us. The locket, and its disturbing contents, was never seen again. It was a clue to a horrifying pattern, a vanished piece of evidence in a crime that had not yet been committed. As the children became more isolated, they began to retreat into a private world of their own, one marked by fear and strange rituals. They developed a silent form of communication, a language of glances and subtle gestures meant to go unnoticed by their constant warden. They seemed to understand that their survival depended on this secret alliance. The shadow woman they had once mentioned became a more prominent figure in their whispered conversations. They no longer believed it was a ghost. They believed it was Miss Reed herself, that she possessed the ability to be in 2 places at once, to watch them even when she was not physically present. They claimed her shadow would detach from her body and linger in the corner of a room, its form dark and indistinct. This belief, born from trauma and fear, speaks to the profound psychological torment they were enduring. The governess had become a figure of almost supernatural terror in their minds, an omniscient, all-powerful being from whom there was no escape. They also began to create their own folklore within the house. The grand staircase was a monster's spine, and certain floorboards that creaked were whispering secrets. The cold spot in the attic was where the hungry darkness lived. These were not games. They were coping mechanisms, attempts to map out the geography of their fear and give names to the invisible threats that surrounded them. They left small offerings, a piece of bread, a shiny button, at the base of the attic stairs, as if to appease the malevolent spirit they believed resided there. What the Monroes saw as childish nonsense, and Miss Reed encouraged as such, was in fact a desperate, heartbreaking attempt by two children to make sense of the insidious evil that had infiltrated their lives. They were building their own mythology of terror because the reality of their situation, that their caretaker was a monster and their parents were blind to it, was simply too horrifying to comprehend. They were alone, trapped in a waking nightmare of their own home, with no one to save them. William Monroe, the patriarch of the family, remains a frustratingly peripheral figure in the events leading up to the tragedy. He was a product of his time, a man whose life revolved around the public sphere of business and politics. The domestic world, the running of the household, the raising of the children, was the exclusive domain of his wife, Genevieve. He trusted her judgment implicitly, and therefore, by extension, he trusted the judgment of the governess she had hired. He saw Miss Reed as an efficient, if somewhat severe, employee. He noted the increased discipline in his children and mistook their fear for respect. In his brief interactions with them in the evenings, he found them quiet and obedient, a stark contrast to the boisterous energy they had once possessed. He viewed this transformation as a positive development, a sign that the governess was successfully molding them into the well-behaved heirs the Monroe name required. His blindness was not born of malice, but of a deeply ingrained cultural detachment. He loved his children in an abstract, proprietary way, but he was not truly present in their daily lives. He did not see the subtle signs of their distress, the fading light in their eyes, because he was not looking for it. He was a man preoccupied with ledgers, shipping manifests, and the delicate political dance of Reconstruction. The quiet drama unfolding under his own roof was invisible to him. This tragic disconnect highlights a chilling aspect of the case. The evil perpetrated by Miss Reed was allowed to flourish not through active collusion, but through passive neglect and societal convention. William Monroe was not a villain, but his absence created a vacuum, a space in which the governess's dark influence could grow unchecked. He was the head of the house, the ultimate authority, yet he was completely oblivious to the predator who was systematically destroying his family from the inside out. His failure to see the truth would cost him everything. The night of the fire, October 29, 1873, was the night of the annual St. Cecilia Ball, the most prestigious social event of the Savannah fall season. For William and Genevieve Monroe, attendance was not optional. It was a command performance, a crucial opportunity to affirm their social standing. As they prepared for the evening, the house was filled with an air of tense anticipation. Genevieve, dressed in an elaborate gown of silk and lace, gave her children a perfunctory kiss goodnight. They seemed unusually subdued, their faces pale in the gaslight. She noted it with a flicker of maternal concern, but Miss Reed was quick to reassure her. "They are merely tired, madam," the governess said in her low, calm voice. "I shall see they are put to bed shortly." This was the last time Genevieve Monroe would see her children alive. The inciting incident for their final, fatal punishment was, by all accounts, heartbreakingly trivial. After the parents had departed in their carriage, Miss Reed discovered a small smudge of mud on the pristine white runner of the main hallway. She immediately accused Thomas of tracking it in from the garden earlier that day. Whether he was guilty or not is irrelevant. In Miss Reed's kangaroo court, the verdict was preordained. When Alina tried to defend her younger brother, she was found guilty as well for the sin of insolence. Their sentence was pronounced with chilling finality, the attic, until their parents returned home. It was the harshest punishment she had ever delivered, not for a few hours but for the entire evening, locked away in the cold, dark space at the top of the house. As she marched them up the stairs, Clara, the housemaid, watched from the shadows, her heart pounding with a nameless dread. She heard the children's quiet, frightened sobs. She heard Miss Reed's cold, emotionless voice telling them to be silent. And then she heard the unmistakable, resonant sound of the heavy iron bolt sliding firmly into place, sealing their fate. With the children locked away, a strange, unnerving calm settled over the Monroe mansion. The remaining staff, feeling the oppressive weight of the governess's presence, retreated to their quarters, leaving the main house to her. What Miss Reed did in those intervening hours is a matter of terrifying speculation, a black hole in the narrative into which our darkest fears can be projected. We know she did not remain in her room. Samuel, the groundskeeper, on his final rounds of the property, saw her moving through the downstairs rooms, a single candle in her hand. He said her movements were not aimless. They seemed methodical, purposeful. She moved from room to room, her silhouette passing behind the tall windows, a solitary, spectral figure in the silent house. Was she selecting the point of ignition? Was she making her final preparations for the horror she was about to unleash? The psychology at play is deeply disturbing. This was not a crime of passion or a sudden, impulsive act. It was premeditated, calculated, and executed with a level of cold-blooded precision that is truly horrifying. She had created the perfect circumstances, the parents away, the children isolated and imprisoned in the most inaccessible part of the house, and the staff safely out of the way. She was the sole, unchecked power in that house. Around 11:30 p.m., she was seen by Clara, who had ventured to the kitchen for a glass of water. Miss Reed was standing in the grand hallway at the very base of the main staircase. She was not holding a candle. She was holding one of the house's heavy brass oil lamps. Their eyes met for a brief second across the cavernous, shadowy space. Clara would later say that the governess's expression was one she would never forget. It was not angry or crazed or fearful. It was serene. An expression of profound, chilling satisfaction. It was the look of a person who was about to complete their life's work. The fire began with an almost gentle whoosh, a sound that was swallowed by the vastness of the house. The oil lamp, deliberately overturned, sent a river of fire cascading across the polished hardwood floors and up the dry, varnished wood of the grand staircase. The flames found purchase instantly, greedily consuming the rich draperies and the wooden paneling. Within minutes, the main artery of the house was an impassable inferno, a roaring chimney of superheated air and toxic smoke. This strategic placement was the work of a cunning, malevolent mind. By setting the fire at the base of the main stairs, Miss Reed achieved two critical objectives. First, she created a formidable barrier, ensuring that even if the staff discovered the fire quickly, they would have no way to reach the upper floors and the attic. Second, she guaranteed that the fire would spread upwards, drawn by the natural flow of air, turning the entire house into a death trap, with the children at its highest, most vulnerable point. The screams from the attic began almost immediately, as the smoke, thick and black, began to seep through the floorboards. It was the sound of children waking not from a nightmare, but into one. Their initial cries of confusion quickly morphed into screams of raw, primal terror as they realized the gravity of their situation. They were trapped in a dark, sealed box that was rapidly filling with smoke, with a raging fire roaring just below them. Downstairs, the staff, now fully awake and in a state of panic, scrambled for a way out. Clara and the cook, Martha, managed to escape through a back door, their lungs burning. They stood on the lawn, watching in horror as the flames burst through the second-story windows, the screams from the attic now a constant, heart-rending wail that pierced the night. It was then that they made the most chilling realization of all. Amidst the chaos, the servants, the neighbors who were beginning to gather, one person was conspicuously absent. Miss Evelyn Reed had vanished. The official response was tragically slow. In 1873, Savannah's Fire Brigade was a volunteer organization, reliant on horse-drawn steam pumpers and the strength of its men. By the time the alarm was raised and the engines arrived at the Monroe estate, the mansion was already a lost cause. The fire had breached the roof, sending a geyser of sparks and embers into the night sky, visible for miles around. The house was a blazing skeleton, its structural integrity collapsing by the minute. The firefighters, faced with the impossible task, focused their efforts on preventing the blaze from spreading to the surrounding properties. They were told by the distraught servants about the children trapped in the attic. A few brave volunteers made a desperate attempt to enter the house from the rear, hoping to find an alternate way up, but they were driven back by the intense heat and the imminent danger of collapse. There was nothing anyone could do. The screams from the attic had long since faded, replaced by the deafening roar of the fire. The crowd of onlookers, neighbors, servants, and now the Monroes themselves, who had been summoned from the ball, could only watch in impotent horror. Genevieve Monroe collapsed on the lawn, her own screams of grief and despair a haunting echo of her children's last cries. William stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, the image of his perfect life being consumed by flames before his very eyes. The horrifying truth of what was happening was slowly dawning on him. This was not an accident. This was an act of unimaginable evil. As the roof of the mansion finally gave way, crashing down into the heart of the inferno in a spectacular, terrible shower of fire, any hope of rescue was extinguished. The attic, the children's prison, was now their tomb. The story of what happened that night would become a permanent, banned topic in polite Savannah society, a macabre tale too horrifying to be spoken of aloud, yet impossible to forget. In the cold, gray light of dawn, the Monroe mansion was a smoking, blackened ruin. The stench of wet ash and death hung heavy in the air. Investigators and fire marshals picked their way through the debris, a grim task made more so by the knowledge of what they were searching for. It did not take them long to find the attic, or what was left of it. The space had been completely gutted by the fire, the heat so intense that it had warped the very structure of the house. It was amidst the charred timbers and piles of ash that they made their heartbreaking discovery. The remains of Eleanor and Thomas Monroe were found near the door, their small forms huddled together in a final, futile embrace. The physical evidence told a horrifying story of their last moments. The inside of the heavy oak door was covered in scratches and gouges, testament to their desperate, frantic attempts to claw their way out. Their small hands had been worn raw, their fingernails broken, as they beat against the unyielding wood that separated them from any chance of survival. But it was another discovery, just a few feet away, that elevated this tragedy into something uniquely monstrous. Lying on the charred floorboards outside the attic door was a melted lump of metal. Upon closer inspection, it was identified as the remains of the large iron key that fit the bolt. The key had not been in the lock. It had been left on the floor, just beyond their reach. This single, macabre detail was the final, damning proof of the governess's intent. She had not merely locked them in. She had locked them in and then symbolically, cruelly, discarded the key, leaving it as a silent testament to her absolute power over their fate. She wanted them to know in their final, terrifying moments that their escape was impossible. It was an act of profound, psychological cruelty, a final, horrifying signature left by a monster who had already disappeared into the night. The search for Miss Evelyn Reed began immediately and with great urgency. She was the only suspect, the central figure in an unthinkable crime. The city's constabulary was mobilized, and descriptions of the governess, provided by the distraught Monroe staff, were circulated throughout Savannah and the surrounding counties. She was described as tall, thin, with pale skin, dark hair pulled back severely, and eyes of a very light, unsettling blue. But this description could have fit countless women. It was a portrait of a ghost. Investigators raced to the train station and the port, hoping to catch her before she could flee, but there was no record of any woman matching her description purchasing a ticket or boarding a ship. They checked the local boarding houses and hotels, with no success. It was as if she had simply dissolved into thin air the moment the first flame was lit. The deeper they dug into her supposed past, the more the mystery deepened. The address in Boston from which she had claimed to have come did not exist. The church of the clergyman who had written her reference letter had burned down a decade earlier. Every lead turned into a dead end, every fact into a fabrication. The name, Evelyn Reed, yielded nothing. It became clear to the authorities that they were not hunting a woman with an identity. They were hunting a carefully constructed persona, a shell created for the express purpose of infiltrating a wealthy family. This realization sent a chill through the investigation. It suggested a level of planning and forethought that was far beyond that of a typical criminal. This was not a disgruntled employee seeking revenge or a common thief. This was something different, something colder and more predatory. The case grew from a horrifying local tragedy into a disturbing nationwide mystery. Who was this woman? How many times had she done this before? And where would she surface next? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the cold case of the Monroe children began to take shape. The psychological profile of a person capable of such an act is a journey into the darkest corners of the human mind. Modern criminologists, looking back at the case, would likely classify the perpetrator behind the Evelyn Reed persona with a host of disturbing labels: malignant narcissist, psychopath, serial arsonist. She displayed a complete lack of empathy, a sadistic need for control, and a chilling ability to mimic normal human emotions in order to manipulate those around her. Her methods were a masterclass in psychological warfare. She didn't just discipline the children, she systematically dismantled their sense of self-worth and security. She isolated them from their parents, their friends, and the rest of the staff, making them entirely dependent on her. This created a closed system in which her abuse could escalate without intervention. The punishments, particularly the use of the locked attic, were designed to instill a profound sense of helplessness and terror. It wasn't just about confinement. It was about sensory deprivation, abandonment, and psychological torture. The use of fire as the final weapon is also deeply significant. Arson is often considered a crime of power, a way for the perpetrator to exert ultimate control over their environment and victims. By locking the children in the attic and then setting the house ablaze from below, she orchestrated a scenario of maximum suffering. She ensured they would be awake, aware, and terrified for the longest possible duration. She turned their home, the very symbol of their safety and privilege, into their funeral pyre. This was not just murder, it was a horrifying theatrical performance of cruelty. It raises the most disturbing question of all. What was her motive? It wasn't money. She took nothing from the house. It wasn't sexual as far as any evidence suggests. The only plausible motive is the act itself. The pleasure derived from the complete and utter destruction of a family. The ultimate, horrifying thrill of playing God. In the wake of the fire, as Savannah society reeled from the horror, local folklore began to reclaim the story, weaving it in to the already dark tapestry of the city's legends. The ruins of the Monroe mansion, a blackened, skeletal husk, became a landmark of fear. Parents would warn their children not to go near the cursed property, telling them that the ghosts of Alina and Thomas still haunted the grounds, forever trapped in their final moments of terror. People living nearby claimed to hear faint, ghostly cries on quiet nights, especially in late October, around the anniversary of the fire. Some even reported seeing a faint, flickering light in the area where the attic window once was, a phantom candle that refused to be extinguished. The figure of Miss Evelyn Reed transformed from a criminal into a local boogeyman, a cautionary tale about the dangers of inviting strangers into one's home. She became the Gray Governess, a spectral figure who preyed on disobedient children. Some versions of the legend claimed she was never human at all, but a demon summoned by the cursed land on which the house was built. These stories, while embellished, served a purpose. They were a way for the community to process an evil so profound that it defied rational explanation. By turning Miss Reed into a supernatural entity, they could place her actions outside the realm of human behavior, making the horrifying truth slightly more palatable. It's easier to believe in a demon than to accept that a seemingly normal woman could be capable of such calculated, sadistic cruelty. The story of the governess who locked children in an attic to burn became a forbidden piece of Georgia history, a chilling ghost story whispered by generations, its horrifying, factual core forever preserved in the amber of local legend. The truth, in this case, was far more macabre than any fiction it inspired. The impact on William and Genevieve Monroe was absolute and devastating. Their perfect world had not just been cracked, it had been obliterated. The fire took not only their children and their home, but also their future, their legacy, and their sanity. Genevieve, who had once been a vibrant, commanding socialite, retreated completely from the world. She fell into a deep, unshakable depression, consumed by a guilt so profound that it bordered on madness. She would spend her days staring into space, sometimes whispering her children's names, other times muttering about the governess, replaying every conversation, every warning sign she had so tragically missed. She had personally welcomed the serpent into her Eden, and she could not forgive herself. William Monroe, a man defined by his strength and control, was broken in a different way. He threw himself into the investigation, spending a vast portion of his remaining fortune on private detectives, chasing down every rumor and false lead in a desperate, obsessive quest for answers and for revenge. He followed whispers of a woman matching Miss Reed's description to cities as far away as New Orleans, Philadelphia, and even London, but each trail grew cold. The phantom he was hunting was always one step ahead, or perhaps had never been there at all. The couple, once a formidable unit, became strangers to each other, each trapped in their own private hell of grief and regret. They sold the land where their home had stood, unable to bear the sight of it. They moved into a small, unassuming house in a different part of the city. There lives a shadow of what they once were. The Monroe name, once a symbol of Savannah's elite, became a byword for tragedy. Within a few years, Genevieve would be committed to a private asylum, and William would die a recluse, a man haunted to his last breath by the ghosts of his children and the face of the woman who had destroyed him. One of the most unsettling aspects of this cold case is the total lack of a body, other than the victims. Miss Evelyn Reed vanished so completely that it fueled speculation that she may have perished in the fire herself, an unidentified casualty of her own horrific act. This theory, however, falls apart under scrutiny. Every person present at the house that night was eventually accounted for, either as a survivor or a victim. The exhaustive search of the ruins turned up only the remains of the two children. Had the governess been trapped and consumed by the blaze she started, some evidence, bone fragments, teeth, remnants of clothing or personal effects, would almost certainly have been found. The fire, while devastating, was not hot enough to completely obliterate a human body without a trace. The investigators concluded with near certainty that she had escaped. This leads to a chilling timeline. She likely fled the house in the immediate chaos after starting the fire, slipping out a back door and into the darkness while the servants were still asleep or just beginning to wake to the smell of smoke. She had a head start of at least 15 to 20 minutes before the alarm was fully raised and the house became a spectacle. In the dark, unlit streets of 1873 Savannah. That was more than enough time for a person on foot to disappear into the city's labyrinthine alleys or the sprawling, unpopulated marshes that surrounded it. She had a plan. Her disappearance was as meticulously orchestrated as the fire itself. The thought of her walking calmly away from the burning mansion, the screams of the children at her back, is perhaps the most horrifying image in this entire macabre affair. She was not a victim. She was the architect of the horror, and she walked away completely unscathed, free to do it all again. Let's reconsider the silver locket Alina found in the attic. This small, vanished object may be the single most important clue in the entire case, hinting at a horrifying, organized pattern of criminality. The locket contained a list of 4 names, each with a corresponding date. The final name was Alina's, and the date was the day of the fire. This strongly suggests that Miss Reed, or whatever entity she was, had done this before. The other names on the list, were they her previous victims? Were the dates the days of their deaths? This possibility transforms the Monroe fire from an isolated incident into a potential serial murder case, spanning multiple years and locations. It opens up a truly dark and disturbing line of inquiry. Did other families in other cities suddenly lose their children in tragic accidents shortly after hiring a new, mysterious governess? A house fire, a drowning, a fatal fall down a flight of stairs, all tragedies that in the 19th century might not have been investigated with the same level of forensic scrutiny as they would be today. The governess, under a different name, could have expressed her grief, collected her final pay, and simply moved on, leaving behind a shattered family who never suspected her involvement. If you find this exploration into the mind of a historical predator fascinating, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel. We believe that some stories are too important and too disturbing to be forgotten. The secrets hinted at by that locket suggest a hidden, banned history of crimes that may have gone entirely unrecorded, and the story of Miss Reed might only be the one chapter we know about. The locket implies a much larger, more terrifying narrative. It suggests that Evelyn Reed was not just a murderer, but a collector of names, a methodical predator who kept souvenirs of her work. The thought of where that locket ended up and what other names might have been added to it is a truly chilling prospect. Could there have been an accomplice? The sheer precision and success of Miss Reed's plan has led some to speculate that she did not act alone. Her ability to create a flawless new identity and to vanish without a trace suggests a level of sophistication that might have required assistance. Was there someone who forged her documents? Someone who arranged for her transport and provided her with a safe house after the crime? This theory opens up a new, even more sinister dimension to the case. It posits the existence of a network, perhaps a secret society or a criminal enterprise, that specialized in this particular brand of macabre infiltration. Imagine an organization that identified wealthy, vulnerable families and then dispatched agents like Evelyn Reed to systematically destroy them for some unknown purpose. The motive remains elusive. Was it for financial gain, with the accomplice inheriting the family's estate through some convoluted legal means? Or was it something more ideological, a bizarre crusade against the wealthy elite? While there is no direct evidence to support the accomplice theory, it provides a potential explanation for some of the case's most baffling elements, namely her perfect getaway and the professional quality of her fabricated identity. It's a deeply unsettling thought that the monster who walked the halls of the Monroe mansion was not a lone wolf, but a soldier in a hidden war, an agent of a larger, unseen evil. This would mean that the true scope of her crimes could be far greater than anyone ever imagined, a dark conspiracy hidden beneath the veneer of respectable society. The Monroe tragedy might have been just one small, horrifying part of a much larger, forbidden puzzle. The cold case isn't just about one vanished woman. It might be about an entire shadow organization that was never brought to light. The story of the Monroe fire had a chilling effect on the profession of governesses throughout the South. For decades afterward, the tale of Evelyn Reed served as a dark cautionary tale. Families became far more scrupulous in their hiring practices, demanding extensive background checks, multiple references, and even photographs of any woman they considered bringing into their home to care for their children. The era of accepting a single, unverified letter of recommendation came to an abrupt end. The governess horror trope, which would later become a staple of Gothic fiction, has its roots in real-life cases like this one. The idea of an educated, seemingly respectable woman who is secretly a malevolent, destructive force played on the deepest anxieties of the Victorian and Edwardian upper classes. The governess occupied a uniquely intimate and yet untrusted position in the household. She was not family, but she was entrusted with the family's most precious asset. She was an insider who remained an outsider, a perfect position from which to observe a family's vulnerabilities and exploit them. The Evelyn Reed case was the ultimate nightmare scenario brought to life. It confirmed the worst fears of a society obsessed with class, status, and the preservation of the bloodline. The story was likely whispered among the wealthy, a banned but essential piece of lore passed from one matriarch to another as a warning. It is a testament to the profound psychological impact of the crime that it single-handedly changed the standards of an entire profession. Evelyn Reed did not just destroy one family. She poisoned a well of trust, casting a long, dark shadow of suspicion over a generation of women whose only crime was their chosen occupation. The fear she created long outlived the flames that consumed the Monroe mansion. One of the most enduring mysteries is what, exactly, Miss Reed buried at the edge of the Monroe property. The groundskeeper, Samuel, witnessed her digging near the old oak tree late one night, burying a small bundle. In the chaotic aftermath of the fire, his account was largely overlooked by investigators who were focused on the more immediate and horrifying evidence within the house itself. By the time anyone thought to excavate the spot, weeks had passed, and the exact location had been lost to memory. This buried object has become a focal point for speculation. What was in that bundle? Some theories suggest it was a curse bag, an object used in folk magic or occult rituals, meant to bring misfortune and death upon the family. This aligns with the more supernatural interpretations of the governess as a demonic entity. Others propose a more practical, yet equally grim, possibility. Perhaps it was evidence of a previous crime, a memento from another family she had destroyed, an object she needed to dispose of before beginning her work in Savannah. Could it have been another locket, or a child's toy, or something even more gruesome? A third theory is that she was burying her own identity. The bundle might have contained documents, letters, or a photograph that linked her to a past life, items that needed to be permanently erased before she could vanish and create a new persona. Whatever it was, the act of burying it suggests it was something of great significance, something she could not risk being found. The secret remains locked in the Georgia soil, a final, macabre puzzle box left behind by the phantom governess. The dying oak tree under which she buried her secret stood for another 50 years, a silent, gnarled monument to the unknown, its roots entwined with a dark history that will likely never be unearthed. Let's analyze the date of the fire, October 29th, just 2 days before Halloween. In the 19th century, Halloween, or All Hallows' Eve, was still deeply steeped in its ancient Celtic and pagan origins. It was a time when the veil between the living and the dead was believed to be at its thinnest, a night of superstition, divination, and heightened spiritual activity. The selection of this date for her final act feels deliberate, adding another layer of macabre theatricality to the crime. Was Miss Reed influenced by these beliefs? Did she see herself as a priestess of some dark rite, offering a human sacrifice on the eve of Samhain? This interpretation paints her not just as a psychopath, but as a ritualist, a woman driven by a twisted, occult belief system. It would explain the strange symbols Clara saw her tracing on the windowsills, and the crude doll made of twine and black cloth found under her mattress, objects often associated with sympathetic magic and curses. This ritualistic aspect makes the crime even more disturbing. It implies a motive beyond human comprehension, a devotion to some dark, unseen power. The fire in this context was not merely an act of murder, it was a ceremony. The Monroe mansion was the altar, and the innocent children were the offering. This theory, while impossible to prove, fits the chilling, almost supernatural efficiency of her actions and her complete disappearance. If she believed she was serving a higher, darker purpose, it would explain her serene, satisfied expression just before she lit the flame. She wasn't just committing a crime, she was fulfilling a destiny. The proximity to Halloween may not be a coincidence, but a final, horrifying clue to the true nature of the evil that called itself Evelyn Reed. Decades after the fire, in the early 1920s, a construction crew was clearing the overgrown, ruined lot where the Monroe Mansion had once stood, preparing to build a new commercial property. As they excavated the foundation, their shovels struck something hard. It was a small, cast-iron box, heavily rusted and fused shut by time and heat. It had been hidden beneath a loose hearthstone in what was once the main fireplace, a secret compartment unknown even to the Monroe family. With great effort, the workers pried the box open. Inside, protected from the flames that had destroyed everything else, was a single, leather-bound journal. The journal did not belong to the Monroes. The handwriting was a severe, angular script, and the entries were meticulous and chillingly devoid of emotion. It was the diary of Evelyn Reed. The diary did not reveal her true name or her origins. Instead, it was a ledger of her obsessions. It contained detailed observations of the families she had targeted, their habits, their weaknesses, their layouts of their homes. It spoke of a great purification by fire and a righteous cleansing. The Monroe family was the fourth entry. The diary confirmed that the names on the locket were indeed her previous victims, children in Baltimore, Charleston, and Mobile, all of whom had died in house fires that had been ruled accidental. The diary was a cold, horrifying manifesto of a serial arsonist and murderer. It detailed her process, infiltration, psychological breakdown of the children, and finally, the final release. The discovery of the diary turned a horrifying piece of local folklore into a documented, multi-state cold case. It was tangible proof of an evil that had moved silently through the heart of the country, leaving a trail of ashes and dead children in its wake. The monster was real, and her name was not Evelyn Reed. Her true name, however, remained a mystery the diary did not solve. The contents of the discovered diary were so disturbing that they were never fully released to the public. The Savannah Police Department, shocked by the scope of the criminality it revealed, kept many of its pages under seal. However, some details were leaked to the press over the years, painting a horrifying portrait of the author's psyche. The diary was not written from a place of rage or passion. The tone was cold, clinical, and detached, like a scientist recording the results of an experiment. She referred to the children not by their names but as the subjects. She cataloged their responses to her disciplinary methods with unnerving precision, noting their levels of fear, their attempts at defiance, and their eventual psychological collapse. She wrote about her victims in Baltimore, a brother and sister named Jacob and Sarah, with chilling indifference. Subject A, Jacob, displayed strong resistance. Subject B, Sarah, was more pliable. The final release was complicated by a faster-than-expected response from the fire brigade. Must choose a more isolated location for the next experiment. The next experiment was in Charleston, and after that Mobile. For each, she documented her methods of infiltration and the accidental fires she orchestrated. The Monroe family was to be her masterpiece. She noted William's absence and Genevieve's vanity as key vulnerabilities. She described Eleanor's intelligence as a challenge to be broken, and Thomas's innocence as tediously simple to corrupt. The diary confirmed the investigator's worst fears. She was a predator who enjoyed the process. The murders were not just the goal, they were the culmination of a long, sadistic game of psychological torture. This diary is one of the most macabre artifacts in the history of American crime, the long-hidden voice of a phantom who turned the sanctity of the home into her personal laboratory of horror. The discovery of the diary in the 1920s reignited the cold case, but it also presented a frustrating paradox. While it confirmed the existence of a serial killer, it provided no clues to her actual identity or her whereabouts. She had been meticulously careful not to include any personal details. The diary was her professional ledger, not a personal confession. Investigators now had a pattern, a series of horrifying crimes to connect, but the central figure remained a ghost. They attempted to reopen the cases in Baltimore, Charleston, and Mobile, but so much time had passed. Witnesses were dead or had moved away, and the original evidence from the accidental fires was long gone. The diary was a roadmap to a lost history of horror, a tantalizing but ultimately untraceable guide. What became of her? After the Savannah fire, did she simply stop? It seems unlikely. A psychopath with such a deeply ingrained, ritualistic pattern of violence does not typically retire. It is far more probable that she continued, creating a new identity and moving to a different part of the country, perhaps even out west, to the burgeoning cities of the Gilded Age. The diary found in the Monroe ruins may only represent the early chapters of her terrifying career. H. How many more entries were there in subsequent journals that were never found? How many more families were purified by her righteous flames? This is the most chilling legacy of the Evelyn Reed case. Not just the horror of what happened to the Monroe children, but the horrifying possibility that it was just one stop on a much longer, bloodier journey. She remains at large in the annals of history, a nameless, faceless specter, the perfect, uncaught killer. The only visual artifact connected to the case is a single, haunting photograph. It was not a portrait of Evelyn Reed, as no confirmed image of her was ever found. Instead, it is a photograph of the Monroe children, Elena and Thomas, taken just a few months before the governess arrived. It is a formal studio portrait, stiff and posed as was the fashion of the time. Elena stands tall and serious, one hand resting on her younger brother's shoulder. Thomas is seated, looking directly at the camera with a bright, innocent curiosity. They are the very picture of privileged, protected childhood. Looking at this photograph is a deeply unsettling experience. We, the viewers, are burdened with the knowledge of their horrifying fate. We see not just two children, but two victims. We can almost see the shadow of the governess falling over them, a darkness that is not yet visible but is fast approaching. The photograph captures the precise moment before their world was shattered, the last vestiges of their innocence before it was systematically stripped away and extinguished. It is a heartbreaking memento mori, a testament to all that was lost. The image serves as a powerful, silent rebuke to the monster who destroyed them. While she succeeded in erasing her own identity, she could not erase theirs. The photograph ensures that Elena and Thomas Monroe are not remembered merely as victims in a macabre ghost story, but as the real children they were. It forces us to confront the human cost of this horrifying crime, to look into the eyes of the two young lives that were so cruelly and senselessly stolen on that dark October night in 1873. In the years that followed the fire, a strange and macabre epilogue unfolded. It seemed that the curse of Evelyn Reed, or the tragedy she had wrought, continued to cling to anyone associated with the case. Dr. Alastair Finch, the physician who had dismissed the children's symptoms, saw his practice crumble. He was not officially blamed, but a cloud of public suspicion hung over him for his failure to recognize the signs of abuse. He died in poverty a decade later. The volunteer fire brigade was heavily criticized for its slow response, leading to a complete overhaul and professionalization of Savannah's fire department. Several of the men who were first on the scene were said to be haunted for the rest of their lives by the sounds they heard and the things they saw. The housemaid, Clara, who carried the heavy burden of being the last person to see the governess, suffered a complete nervous breakdown. She spent years in and out of institutions, tormented by nightmares of fire and the serene, smiling face of the woman who started it. It was as if a shockwave of misery radiated out from the crime, touching and tainting everyone in its path. The evil of that one night did not end when the flames were extinguished. It lingered, a poison that seeped into the community, a permanent scar on the city's soul. This lingering trail of despair is a testament to the sheer destructive power of the woman who called herself Evelyn Reed. She did not just take two lives. She shattered dozens, ruining reputations, breaking minds, and leaving a legacy of sorrow that would echo through generations. Her macabre masterpiece was more complete than even she might have intended. The ultimate fate of Miss Evelyn Reed is, and will forever remain, a mystery. Did she live out a long life, dying peacefully in her bed, a nameless old woman with a lifetime of horrifying secrets? Did she ever feel a flicker of remorse, or was she a psychopath until the very end, incapable of such an emotion? Or did she perhaps meet her own violent end, a victim of some other unrelated crime, her body buried in an unmarked grave, her true identity never discovered? The diary, for all it revealed about her methods, offered no clues to her endgame. The lack of resolution is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire affair. We crave justice, we need closure, but this story offers none. The villain does not get her comeuppance. The monster is not slain. She simply walks off the final page of the story and disappears into history. This void of information has allowed her to become a figure of pure myth, a blank slate onto which we can project our deepest fears about the nature of evil. She represents the terrifying idea that evil is not always recognizable, that it can wear a disguise of respectability and intelligence, and that it can walk among us, completely undetected. Evelyn Reed Cold Case is a chilling reminder that not all monsters have fangs and claws. Some carry forged letters of recommendation and speak in calm, melodic tones. And some are so adept at their horrifying craft that they can commit the most unspeakable acts and then simply vanish, leaving behind nothing but ashes, ghosts, and a story so macabre it can still make our blood run cold, more than a century and a half later. What can we learn from a story this dark, a forbidden history so steeped in tragedy? It serves as a stark warning about the dangers of blind trust and the willful ignorance that can fester behind the closed doors of respectable society. William and Genevieve Monroe were not evil people. They were products of their time, blinded by their own privilege and their faith in social conventions. They saw in Miss Reed what they wanted to see, an emblem of order and discipline. They ignored the whispers of their staff and the visible terror in their own children's eyes, because to acknowledge it would have been to admit a catastrophic failure in their own judgment. It would have shattered their carefully constructed world of perfection. Their tragedy is a lesson in the importance of looking past the surface, of listening to the quiet voices that are trying to warn us, and of trusting our instincts when something feels deeply and fundamentally wrong. The evil of Evelyn Reed was able to flourish in the fertile soil of their complacency. She was a predator who knew exactly how to exploit the social codes of her era. The horror of what happened in that Savannah mansion is not just the story of a single, monstrous individual. It is also the story of a system that enabled her, a society that was not equipped to see the monster standing right in front of them, dressed in the unassuming clothes of a governess. It is a cold case that forces us to question how many other monsters have slipped through the cracks of history, their crimes hidden by the very societies they preyed upon. In the end, we are left with nothing but haunting questions. Who was she, this woman who wore the name Evelyn Reed like a costume? What trauma or innate darkness created such a cold, methodical monster? Was she acting alone, or was she part of some larger, more sinister conspiracy that we can only guess at? The diary provides the what and the how, but it will never give us the why. Her motives remain locked away in the mind of a ghost. The story of the Monroe children and their terrifying governess has become a permanent fixture in the landscape of American macabre folklore. It is a story that has been told and retold, each telling adding a new layer of legend, but at its core remains a horrifying, unsolved truth. An evil came to Savannah in 1873. It lived in a beautiful home. It was entrusted with the care of two innocent children, and it orchestrated their agonizing deaths with chilling precision. And then it vanished. The case remains open, a file gathering dust in an archive, a testament to a crime so perfectly executed that its perpetrator achieved a terrifying kind of immortality. She became a ghost story, a phantom who haunts the dark corners of our history, a perpetual, chilling reminder that the most horrifying monsters are the ones who look just like us.